Hey everyone, I think we are live. Just waiting to see here. Yeah, we should be live. I'm just waiting. Yes, we are live. Welcome to Yissilmissil Productions channel. My name is Stephen Yissel. Today we are diving back into the Bermuda Triangle, and particularly the book by Charles Berlitz. And this is a book from the 1970s. We've covered the first 3 chapters already. And today we have chapter 4, which is titled Some Who Escaped. So this will be a nice little reading session here. I got some photographs in this chapter to show all you. Yeah, I think this is going to be a good good addition to what we've been talking about already. So, I guess just to give a quick summary, we covered a lot of documented disappearances of planes as well as boats, and all of the circumstances surrounding each individual situation. Some involving dogs and birds. But, yeah, so we're going to be reading chapter 4. And, yeah, as we get going through this, I'll share my thoughts. But, I'm trying to reserve those for a little later in the deep dive here, once we get through some material. But as of right now, there's a lot of connections with ley lines for me. Also, the odd and strange disappearances in the water or around the water, I think is very interesting. So, without further ado, let's get going. Chapter 4, Some Who Escaped. In his book, Invisible Horizons, a compendium of mysteries of the sea, Vincent Gaddis, spelled Gaddis, in a special section devoted to the Bermuda Triangle, the Triangle of Death, recounts that shortly after he wrote his original article on the Bermuda Triangle in 1964, an article that apparently gave it its name, he received a letter from an ex-airman named Dick Stern containing pertinent and surprising information. Stern wrote that toward the end of the 1944, he had taken part in a flight destined for Italy. The flight consisted of a group of 7 bombers, and about 300 miles off Bermuda, his plane suddenly experienced such unexpected and violent turbulence that it had to return to the United States. When this occurred, the weather was clear and the stars were visible, but the turbulence caused the plane to turn over and to pitch so violently that the crew was thrown to the ceiling. The turbulence caused the plane to lose altitude to a point where it was almost forced into the sea. When his plane returned to base, he learned that only one other plane had returned from the flight of 7, and there had been no radio contact with the others and no subsequent survivors or wreckage located. This incident, which happened a year before the loss of Flight 19, also in December, was not considered as an unusual loss since it occurred in wartime and was given no publicity. Some years after the war, Stern and his wife were on a daytime flight from Bermuda to Nassau in Bristol, Britannia, when a somewhat similar happening occurred. By a curious coincidence, Mrs. Stern was, at that very moment, talking about the previous incident. Suddenly, the plane dropped without warning. The food which the passengers were eating hit the ceiling, and the plane shook violently. It continued to shake and rise and fall for a quarter of an hour. This phenomenon may be an example of clear air turbulence, CAT, which, if intensive or prolonged enough, would possibly cause some planes to be shaken apart and scattered over the sea. In any case, Dick Stern has the distinction of having encountered the same unexpected and menacing force twice at almost the same place in the triangle, and lived to tell about it. Joe Talley, captain of a fishing boat, the Wild Goose, experienced a different, though not in his case at least, fatal way of disappearing within the triangle. It did not concern a plane, but his own boat, in tow behind another boat, on the surface of the sea. The locale of his experience was the tongue of the ocean, an extremely deep area within the Bahama group, but not part of the Bahama Banks, in that its relatively small area is thousands of feet deep. A precipitous drop-off directly east of Andros Island, and the site of many disappearances. Captain Talley's 65-foot shark fishing vessel was to be towed south in the tongue of the ocean by the 104-foot Cacios trader. The weather was good, with a brisk trade wind coming from the southwest. The two vessels were approaching the southern section of the tongue of the ocean, where this submarine canyon emerges into a great crater-like hole at its south end with a diameter of 40 miles. Reefs in the Exuma chain to the east protect the tongue of the ocean at this point from excessively high seas that might develop from southeast trade winds. It was nighttime and Captain Talley was asleep in his bunk below decks. Suddenly, he was awakened by a flood of water pouring over him. He automatically grabbed a life jacket and fought his way to an open porthole. As he forced his way out, he found he was underwater, but he encountered a line and followed it to the surface, a distance calculated as being from 50 to 80 feet. He had apparently been submerged to a distance of 40 to 50 feet when he escaped from his quarters. When he got to the end of the line and the surface, he found that the Cacios trader had continued on its way without him. What had happened was that the sudden force which was drawing the Wild Goose underwater toward the bottom, with Captain Talley on board, was threatening to capsize the Cacios trader because of the connecting tow line. The crew of the towboat cut the tow line, left the immediate area, and then turned about to see if by some miracle Talley had managed to escape from the cabin of his craft as it was drawn down beneath the sea. The crew of the towboat had seen the Wild Goose go straight down as if in a whirlpool. Hey Jason, I see you there. After about half an hour, Talley, now about to sink, was surprised to hear his name shouted over the water by megaphone from the now returned Cacios trader. He was able to shout a reply and was subsequently rescued. As most captains in the area are familiar with the many unexplained losses of craft, often accompanied by compass and radio malfunction, inquiry was made concerning the behavior of the compass during the incident. It was found, however, that the helmsman had set the course and had left the wheel during the incident, so there was no way of telling if there had been a mechanical aberration at that time. Other boats have lost their tows in the area, sometimes losing the crew as well as the boat they were towing, unlike Captain Talley, who lived to tell about his experience. In some cases, what seems to be a fog has covered the second ship, and there has been malfunction of compass and electrical equipment on the first ship. One wonders why there are reports from towboats about these forces and not from single boats. Perhaps this is because single boats simply disappear without witnesses, while towboats are close enough at the end of a line to observe what is happening. I think that's a very key point there. The experience of Captain Don Henry in 1966 gives a graphic account of a tug of war between the towboat and an unidentified force attempting, consciously or unconsciously, to capture the barge. Captain Henry Captain Henry is the owner of a salvage company in Miami called the Sea Phantom Exploration Company, and he has had many years' experience as a sea captain, navigator, and both a hard hat and free diver. He is about 55 years old, heavy, with a powerful chest and arms befitting a longtime diver. He gives the impression of being extremely solid and muscular, and, for a heavy man, moves with surprising lightness and speed. To make a point, he will bring one fist into the cup of his other hand and make an illustrative gesture, which gives one the impression that it would not be good to find oneself on the receiving end of his fist. His eyes, accustomed to watching the sea, are frank and penetrating. His certainty in his conversation and recall of detail make it pertinent to let Captain Henry recount the incident in his own words, noted during a conversation concerning the disappearing barge. Alright, so what's next is his first-hand account here. We were coming in on the return trip between Puerto Rico and Fort Lauderdale. We had been out for 3 days towing an empty barge which had carried petroleum nitrate. I was aboard the Good News, a 160-foot-long tug of 2,000 horsepower. The barge we were towing weighed 2,500 tons and was on a line 1,000 feet behind. We were on the tongue of the ocean after coming through the Yissilmissil. The depth was about 600 fathoms. It was afternoon, the weather was good, and the sky was clear. I had gone to the cabin and back of the bridge for a few minutes when I heard a lot of hollering going on. I came out of the cabin onto the bridge and yelled, "What the hell is going on?" The first thing I looked at was the compass, which was spinning clockwise. There was no reason that this should ever happen. The only place besides here I ever heard it happen, let me reread that. The only place besides here I ever heard it to happen was in the St. Lawrence River at Kingston, where a big deposit of iron or maybe a meteorite on the bottom makes the compasses go crazy. I did not know what had happened, but something big was sure as hell going on. The water seemed to be coming from all directions. The horizon disappeared. We couldn't see where the horizon was. The water, sky, and horizon all blended together. We couldn't see where we were. Whatever was happening robbed, stole, or borrowed everything from our generators. all electric appliances and outlets ceased to produce power. The generators were still running, but we weren't getting any power. The engineer tried to start an auxiliary generator, but couldn't get a spark. I was worried about the tow. It was tight, but I couldn't see it. It seemed to be covered by a cloud, and around it the waves seemed to be more choppy than in other areas. I rammed the throttles full ahead. I couldn't see where we were going, but I wanted to get the hell out in a hurry. It seemed that something wanted to pull us back, but it couldn't quite make it. Coming out of it was like coming out of a fog bank. When we came out, the tow line was sticking straight out like the Indian rope trick, with nothing visible at the end of it, where it was covered by a fog concentrated around it. I jumped to the main deck and pulled. The damned barge came out of from the fog, but there was no fog anyplace else. In fact, I could see for 11 miles. In the foggy area where the tow should have been, the water was confused, although the waves were not big. Call me Nero, not hero. I wasn't going back to find out what it was that was back there. Have you ever felt two people pulling on your arms in opposite directions? It felt that we were on a place or point that somebody or something wanted, and somebody or something wanted us to be in another place from where we were going. Then it says, question, was there a greenish appearance to the horizon? And his answer, no, it was milky. That's all I could say. I wasn't looking for colors. After we left, the batteries had to be recharged. I had to throw away 50 flashlight batteries. So the batteries lost all power. And then another question, did you think of the Bermuda Triangle? And his answer, yes, it was the only thing I could think of at that time. I thought, my God, I am another statistic. Then another question, did you ever have other experiences like this? And his answer, no. I've heard other people have, and that one tow was lost with the people on it and with the tow cable cut. But this was the only experience I had. Once was plenty. Jim Richardson, a former Navy pilot, is now president of Opa-locka Flight Center, operating between Opa-locka Airport in Miami and Bimini and other points in the Bahamas. As president of the most important passenger service in the area and an outstanding promoter of Bimini, he maintains what may be termed a non-committal attitude about the alleged menace of the Bermuda Triangle. He expresses one local reaction to the spread of a legend with the pilot's pithy directness. It's something people don't talk about. They say you're out of your goddamn mind. Nevertheless, in his numerous flights to the Bahamas, he too has encountered electronic and magnetic aberrations. On an early morning flight from Florida to Turks Islands, accompanied by his son, the plane's compass suddenly started to spin from left to right. He asked his son, "What's wrong with the compass?" To which his son replied, as a perfectly natural explanation, "We are over Andros." He observes this has frequently happened every time we go over deep waters in front of Moselle Reef. This reef, incidentally, is a place often noted for the presence of mysterious lights shining at night, and among the fishermen of Bimini, has a reputation of being haunted. These lights on the reef have also been observed by the same Jim Richardson and other pilots of planes and ships. A more pronounced electronic incident is recounted by Chuck Wakely, where an electric force or electronic force or presence seemed temporarily to take possession of his plane, and while he was flying between Nassau and Fort Lauderdale. Chuck Wakely is about 30 years old and has been a professional pilot of planes and helicopters for over 10 years. He has had considerable flying experience, much of it solo over the jungles of Panama and South America, where a good memory for details and a cool reaction for emergencies are often the secrets of survival. He is a trained observer and holds a high security clearance from the United States government. Talking to him one is impressed by his sincerity and his effort to recount his experience exactly as it happened. He is an expressive speaker, and it is interesting to note that he has not heard of the Bermuda Triangle as such until after his experience. And so I guess he writes about and shares his experience here. In November of 1964, I was a pilot for Sunline Aviation in Miami. During this time, I took a charter flight to Nassau to drop off some people and return. I dropped off the passengers and left Nassau Airport shortly after dark. The weather was very clear and the stars were shining. I was tracking about outbound on the Nassau VOR, Visual Omni Range, to intercept the Bimini VOR en route. At about 9:30 p.m., I passed the northern tip of Andros Island and could see the lights of some of the settlements. I had leveled off at about 8,000 feet and was settling back for a routine flight, but 30 to 50 miles past Andros on a direct heading for Bimini, I began to notice something unusual, a very faint glowing effect on the wings. At first I thought it was an illusion created by the cockpit lights shining through the tinted plexiglass windows, because the wings had a translucent appearance, appearing pale blue-green, although they were actually painted bright white. In the course of about 5 minutes, this glow increased in intensity until it became so bright that I had great difficulty reading my instruments. My magnetic compass began revolving, slowly but steadily. The fuel gauges, which had read half full at takeoff, now read full. My electric autopilot suddenly put the aircraft into a hard right turn, and I had to shut it off and operate manually. I could not trust any of the electronically run instruments, as they were either totally out or behaving erratically. Soon the whole aircraft was glowing, but it was not a reflected glow, since the glow was coming from the aircraft itself. When I looked out the window at the wings, I remember noticing that they were not only glowing bluish green, but also looked fuzzy. At this point, I could no longer rely on my gyro, horizon, or altitude indicators, and since it was night and I was flying with an artificial horizon, I had no horizon to go by. The glow was so intense that I could no longer see the stars. I did the only thing I could. That was to let go of the controls and let the craft fly on whatever heading it would take. The glow built up to a blinding crescendo of light, lasted for about 5 minutes, and then diminished gradually. All instruments began to function normally as soon as the glowing dissipated. I checked all circuit breakers and none had popped. No fuses were blown, and I realized that equipment was functioning normally when the fuel gauges returned to reading that the tanks were half full. The magnetic compass became steady and showed that I was only a few degrees off course. I engaged the autopilot and it was normal. Before landing, I checked all systems, landing gear, flaps, and so on. They were all normal. Incidentally, the aircraft had static lines, and should have drained all static elements. And a question: did you think your experience was connected with the Bermuda Triangle? And his answer: I did not know about the Bermuda Triangle until after the incident. I thought what I had seen was St. Elmo's fire, in spite of the fact that St. Elmo's fire doesn't act that way. And another question: when did you hear about the Bermuda Triangle? And his answer: I heard about it when I started to speak to other pilots about my experience. Things like that have happened to other pilots, but they don't like to talk about it. Anyhow, there's no way to avoid what they call the triangle if you go to some place like Puerto Rico, unless you fly up north of Bermuda. You hear a lot more about the triangle now, especially when any completely illogical disappearance of a plane happens. What may have been a visual observation seen from the air of some destructive force within the triangle was reported in Pursuit, a quarterly review published by the Society for the Investigation of the Unexplained. The author of the report, Robert Durand, tells of an incident observed from the control nacelle of a Boeing 707 on a flight from San Juan to New York on April 11, 1963. The location of the sighting was reported as 19 degrees 54 feet north latitude and 66:47 west longitude, a point well within the triangle over the Puerto Rico Trench, one of the ocean's deepest canyons where the sea reaches a depth of 5.5 miles. The unusual sighting, first reported by the co-pilot, anonymous by preference, took place at 1:30 p.m., 29 minutes after takeoff, when the jet was at an altitude of 31,000 feet. The co-pilot suddenly noticed about 5 miles to starboard from the route the jet was following that the ocean was rising into a great round mound, as if from an underwater atomic explosion, and that it looked like a big cauliflower in the water. He immediately called the captain's and the flight engineer's attention to it, and they observed it in detail for about 30 seconds, and then unfastened their seatbelts and climbed over to starboard for a still better view. The roiling titanic mount of water attained, in their judgment, a diameter of half a mile to a mile, with a height of perhaps half its width. Understandably, the captain did not go back for a closer look, but kept to his schedule. As the plane left the area, the enormous boiling mound was seen to be beginning to subside. The co-pilot later checked several agencies, including the Coast Guard and the FBI, as well as a seismic specialist, but received no corroborating information of anything unusual. Sorry, we got some photographs here. A lot. Just cuts off in the middle of that. Such as earthquakes, tidal waves, or enormous water spouts having transpired in the area. Okay, what I think I'll do is read the final 3 pages here, and then I'll go back into this chapter and show close to a dozen photographs. It's inserted right in the middle of this chapter, so I'll finish reading, and then I'll show these photographs and read the captions under them, and then that'll be it for today. So let's continue. It has been variously suggested that this apparent atomic explosion may have had something to do with the atomic submarine USS Thresher, which has been lost on the previous day, or its atomic warheads, although the Thresher was reported lost thousands of miles away. This theory, of course, would only be valid if important elements in the loss of the Thresher had been kept secret, which is possible, or, as has been informally theorized, if a submarine of a potential enemy had been attacked or sunk in retaliation for the Thresher's sinking. But discounting the military hypothesis, the point of occurrence constitutes still another affirmation of the forces at work within the Bermuda Triangle. Another recent account of what might have been an escape by surface craft was recounted by the participants to Norman Bean, electronic engineer and inventor, whose inventions include closed-circuit underwater television and shark repellent. Norman Bean, a resident of Miami, is a lecturer on UFOs and a close observer of a phenomenon in the Bermuda Triangle. The incident took place on an evening in September 1972 between Featherbed Banks and Matheson Hammock in Biscayne Bay, and concerned a diesel-powered boat with the ominous name of Nightmare. The Nightmare, carrying 3 passengers, was returning to port at night, appropriately from a fishing trip in Biscayne Bay. When it reached the Featherbed Banks area, it was noticed that the compass was off about 90 degrees as compared with the lights of its destination, Coconut Grove. The boat lights became weak and then were extinguished, as if there had been a tremendous drain exerted on the batteries. Thereupon, disregarding the compass reading, the pilot steered directly for landmarks due west under full power. But the only change in position was to the north, as ascertained by shore lights slipping to the south. For 2 hours the boat continued toward the shore, but was unable to make any progress, it seemed, if anything, to be backing up. During this time, a large dark shape blotting out the stars was noted by the occupants of the boat in the air between the boat and the Matheson Hammock, a mile or 2 to the west. As they watched it, they noticed a moving light enter the dark area, remain poised for a few moments, and then disappear. Shortly afterward, the dark shape also disappeared. After the disappearance, the compass returned to normal. The generator recharged the batteries, and the boat was able to proceed forward. Give me one moment here. An almost identical experience was reported to Bean by a member of the audience at one of his lectures given some years prior to the case of the Nightmare. The individual, a retired U.S. Navy captain, was unwilling to discuss the incident at the lecture, but later told Bean about it in private, as he, like so many observers of unexplainable phenomenon, was unwilling to jeopardize his reputation for veracity or exact observation. The incident happened a week before Christmas 1957. A 35-foot diesel-powered fishing boat belonging to and piloted by the captain on a course to Freeport in the Bahamas was unable to proceed forward for a period of several hours and was even pushed backward several miles. The generator went out as well as the lights and radio, and the compass went into a spin. Although the diesel engine kept running, the boat was unable to make any headway. As in the case of the Nightmare, the crew noted that although the water was calm and the stars bright, a certain area of the sky dead ahead on their intended course showed a starless black patch of regular outline. At one point, they saw 3 moving lights in a row enter this dark area and disappear. Shortly afterward, the black patch in the sky suddenly lifted, and the boat was able to resume progress forward. The lights in the battery-operated radio went on, and the compass returned to normal. The captain and his 4 passengers had later learned that during the same night, 40 miles away, a freighter that had been navigating the Gulf Stream southward ended up breached on a mud bank to the west near Fort Lauderdale, its steering device having suffered a 90-degree deflection. I'd say that's pretty significant. That doesn't just happen on its own. An incident which happened to a twin-engine Beechcraft on a flight from Georgetown to Great Exuma, Bahamas, on November 15th, 1972, is an interesting example of the capriciousness of these forces, and at least one case, if motives and reason can be attributed to them, or they seem to aid rather than destroy the plane. Dr. S.F. Jablonski, a Fort Lauderdale psychologist, made the following report to Dr. Manson Valentine, who recalls it as follows. The plane left Georgetown at twilight with 9 people aboard, including 5 pilots. The weather was good, the sea was calm, and the visibility was excellent. There was a light breeze from the southeast. About 10 minutes after takeoff, when the aircraft was over the tongue of the ocean northwest of Exuma, all electrically operated systems, compass, radio, lights, and even hydraulic controls suddenly and rapidly deteriorated, and all batteries drained completely. The pilot's first reaction was to try to land at New Providence, approximately 60 miles due north, as he could navigate by the setting sun until the lights of Nassau became visible. On second thought, however, he remembered that the radio was out and he could not advise the airport of his arrival, and he had no lights working to signal his approach. It was therefore decided to head straight for the nearest airship on Andros, and soon they were able to distinguish the little airport near the south end of the island. For landing in these circumstances, the captain undertook a glide pattern after a turn west of the airstrip to make certain there were no obstructions and to get lined up as accurately as possible with the runway and wind. Since the hydraulic system was not operating, the landing wheels could not be lowered, and of course there were no landing lights. Dr. Jablonski later observed that the plane seemed to be landing as if buoyed up on a cushion of air. The ends of the propellers touched the ground first, setting off a shower of sparks, but instead of crashing, the plane settled on the ground. There was no damage to the fuselage, and even the low-hanging air scoops were intact. On the following day, 2 new propellers were sent out to Andros and installed. The plane's batteries were recharged, but even before this, the hydraulic system had regained its functions. The flight took off again and arrived at Fort Lauderdale without further incident. As this book goes to press, the Cunard liner Queen Elizabeth II has just escaped an appointment with disaster in the upper center of the Bermuda Triangle. On April 3rd, 1974, due to a breakdown of 3 of her boilers attributed to an oil leak, an interruption of electric power, air conditioning, etc., this most modern of superliners lay becalmed, like her predecessors of past ages, in the Sargasso Sea, while the passengers awaited rescue, consoled by free though warm drinks offered by the line. In one of the first radio interviews from aboard ship, a professional football player passenger, the cruise was designated Sun and Fun Pigskin Cruise, said on the air, "The captain tells me that we are sitting right here in the middle of the Bermuda Triangle." Subsequent reports, however, seemed studiously to avoid any reference to this fateful area. As a footnote to the incident, it is interesting to note that radar disappearance of the Queen Elizabeth II was reportedly observed by a crew member of a Coast Guard cutter following the vessel. As the Queen Elizabeth II, making 35 knots, entered the triangle, the cutter lost it on radar, although it remained visibly in sight, disappearing shortly thereafter. The cutter's communication with the Queen Elizabeth II and radar contact seemed to be affected from the moment the vessel entered the triangle. Whether it has not yet been suggested, or while it has not yet been suggested, that the mysterious forces of the triangle were somehow involved in the Queen Elizabeth II breakdown, it is possible that the radar communication with the cutter could have been affected by known radio and electrical anomalies existent within the Bermuda Triangle. When we consider the total number of plane and ship disappearances, as well as the pattern of what have apparently been escapes from forces at work within the area of the Bermuda Triangle, we must also consider the possibility of there being a logical explanation or a variety of logical explanations for these happenings. The deeper we go into the problem, however, the more we begin to wonder whether there even exists within our familiar framework of scientific reference what might be called a logical explanation. And that is chapter 4. So we have photographs in the book here, and I am going to read the notes underneath each of them and show you. So the first one here says, "Flight of TBM Avengers, similar to the 5 planes of Flight 19, which vanished with a total of 5 officer pilots and 9 crew members on December 5th, 1945. While on a short routine training mission from Fort Lauderdale Naval Air Station after a series of radio messages indicating that their compasses and gyros were going crazy, that everything looked wrong and strange, and that the ocean did not look as it should. No trace of the planes or crews no trace of the planes or crew was found, despite intensive air and sea search of 380,000 square miles of land and sea." So this is TBM Avengers. And then the photo below, it says, "Closer view of Grumman Avenger bomber of the type that figured in the loss of Flight 19. The bombers were equipped with life rafts and were capable of a 1.5-minute flotation in case of crash landing in water. Crews were trained to abandon ship in 60 seconds. These factors, as well as the relative closeness of the incident to the base, makes the complete disappearance of all 5 planes and crews all the more mysterious." And the photos from courtesy of Grumman Aircraft. So next we have crash of a TBM Avenger torpedo bomber, similar to the 5 planes lost in Flight 19. While planes that crash into the sea usually leave an oil slick or some wreckage, the complete disappearance of Flight 19 elicited observations from the Naval Board of Inquiry such as, "They vanished completely, as if they had flown to Mars. And this photo is from the National Archives, just showing what a down plane would look like, which they never found for Flight 19. Next photo says, the USS Cyclops lost on March 4th, 1918. The unexplained disappearance of the Cyclops with 309 persons aboard has been classified as one of the most baffling mysteries in the annals of the Navy. Following the theory that it may have been sunk by a German submarine, a post-war check of German sub-operations revealed no German subs to have been in the area at the time. And this photo is from the official U.S. Navy photo. And the one below it says a British vessel, also named the Cyclops, was lost in the North Atlantic during World War II. Again, a later examination of German submarine records showed no German subs to have been in the vicinity. The photos from National Archives. All right, the next photo. Martin Mariner flying boat of the type similar to the plane sent to aid Flight 19. Shortly after takeoff on its search and rescue mission, the Martin Mariner sent one message and then also disappeared with its crew of 13. And this photo is from the National Archives. And then next we have the MS Marine Sulphur Queen, a 425-foot freighter with a crew of 39. This large vessel disappeared in good weather on February 2nd, 1963, somewhere near the Dry Tortugas. No trace of the freighter or crew was ever found, with the exception of a solitary life jacket found at sea 15 miles south of Key West. And photos from the National Archives. Just a few more photos here. We have C-119 of type which disappeared with crew of 10 in June 1965 within 100 miles of Grand Turk Island, Bahamas. At time of disappearance, weather was clear and visibility good. Then we have KC-135 Stratotanker used for refueling. Two planes of this type were lost in August 1963, approximately 300 miles southwest of Bermuda. Since debris from the planes was found after an extensive search, it was presumed they had collided, but wreckage of the two planes was found at spots 160 miles distant one from the other. Photo courtesy of the Boeing company. All right, and next we have photograph taken from Earth orbit looking south, showing the southern half of Florida, the Bahama Islands, Andros, Grand Bahama, and Bimini, and part of Cuba. Dark area of sea shows the deep water between Florida and the Bahamas, where many of the unexplained disappearances of planes and ships have taken place. Submerged Bahama banks are shown as lighter ocean areas near islands. The photo is courtesy of National Aeronautics and Space Administration. So again, not sure. They already mentioned here that this is a doctored photograph. So I would call it an artistic topographical map. All right. Next, we got diver on edge of the Bahama Banks, an enormous submerged plateau of which the Bahama Islands are the crests. This huge underwater plateau is frequently honeycombed by limestone caves, which sometimes connect with the lakes in the interior of the present islands. Photo is by Paul Yissilmissil, courtesy of Skin Diver magazine. It's kind of cool to hear about the plateau there. And then we got scuba diver diving over the edge of the continental shelf in the Bahamas. While the sea bottom in large areas in the vicinity of the Bahamas is relatively shallow, the edge of the Bahama Banks drops sharply off to tremendous depths. Photos also by Paul Yissilmissil, courtesy of Skin Diver magazine. So just some people exploring the area there. Then our final picture from the chapter. It says interior view of a blue hole, one of the underwater caves in the Bahama Banks. Strong currents sweep through these passageways, and some small boats have been found wedged inside them. Stalactites and stalagmites within the blue holes indicate that they once existed above sea level for a considerable period of time. The photo is by, again, Paul Yissilmissil, courtesy of Skin Diver magazine. So that is it for today. Next week, we will be covering Chapter 5. Is there a logical explanation? Yeah, that'll be good enough. A good chunk of pages there. So next week it'll probably be a little longer of an episode here. But we are slowly getting through this book. We're getting a lot of factual information here. Very good, and we kept it under an hour today. So we'll be back next week, and we will continue our journey through this book. And next chapter doesn't have too many photographs or lithographs, drawings, so it's going to be more of a wordy, just me reading next week. But it looks like the rest of the chapters all have some imagery. So either way, it'll be a good show next week. And as I pull more data points together here, I'll be having more of a slideshow going on. But yeah, excellent. I'm glad we stayed under an hour. So, this is going to be it for today. Hope you all enjoyed it. There's definitely a lot to look into with the Bermuda Triangle. And, yeah, we're looking at some of the most notable instances of last century. At least when it was peaking out. And we'll see how things are after this book from like 74 to now. So we'll also look at that later on. But yeah, thank you everyone. I appreciate you. And I hope you have a good rest of your week. And be back here on Saturday morning at 11 o'clock Central Standard Time. We'll be back on here with the Chicago History series for part 2 of that. And until then, please, everyone, take care of yourselves. And, yeah, until the next one. Class dismissed.